China's working on its Made in China 2025 push.
The US is playing with fire, but China has fire too.
Global economic powerhouse.
Young Chinese people are becoming disillusioned with everyday life.
China has mobile payment,
cashless.
a cashless society. All use QR codes.
China. People think I don't like China. I love China.
Hello, 大家好. Welcome back to another episode of China WTF. So for this episode, we had we had a moment of inspiration. So I left my phone at home one day, and we thought it'd be interesting for us to ask the question of whether we can live a day without our phones and what that would be like. In the UK, it's very different to when we leave our phones at home in China, for a variety of reasons, which we'll discuss throughout the episode. And as ever, I'm joined by Louisa, who's the brains behind the operation. And we also have a special guest today, Sam Phillips. So do you want to introduce yourself to our audience?
I do, absolutely. So I am the account director here at Qumin, which basically means I'm responsible for all of our business from global brands, both Western and Chinese, as we help them launch into new markets, engage with wider audiences, and more deeply engage with their existing users. My background is in digital media, where I worked for 7 years at one of the UK's most creative and successful media agencies in Manning Gottlieb. Now Qumin. We're the next one. Where I manage brands, including Sony Pictures and Apple.
Just some small brands then.
Just a couple of, little ones.
So we always ask people when they come on the show what their China story is, because we think it's always interesting to ask people. The China side adds like another interesting, just another level of complexity on top of their kind of like choosing profession or niche. So maybe you could tell us what your China story is. Sure.
I've been fascinated by China since a young age, actually, because I grew up in a family full of Asian art dealers. So wow. I know, that's kind cool. Of obscure, but true. So I always heard amazing stories about China and the Far East, and it just sounded like such an exciting place with a massive opportunity.
And it must change a lot for the family members you mentioned. It sounds like they've been doing it for quite a while since you were young. And
yeah, absolutely, many generations.
How do you feel about like the changes that's happening in China? And everyone's always gets really kind of like surprised about how fast China is moving. We talk about a lot of that on the show as well. Have they spoke to you about what they've experienced?
Yeah, so I always remember my uncle telling me a story about him taking a cab.
I love stories.
Taking a cab in China. It's short but sweet. But he was just taking a random cab somewhere, and he was having a little bit of a chat with the cab driver, and it was amazing to him that this cab driver, on the side of driving the cab, he was an entrepreneur. He had like an internet startup. So it was like the sense of opportunity and sort of you can make something of yourself, and riding that huge wave of, I suppose, economic boom out there.
It kind of feels like it's like American history during kind of like the gold rush period, right? There's opportunities everywhere. Everyone's trying to do something. Everyone's open to doing something. You go to any bar in Shanghai, right? Like you talk to someone about something, and the next thing you know, you guys are like partners in like a new startup or something crazy.
Yeah,
and that's what I love about China as well.
The Chinese dream as well. So it started from the American dream that you could make anything of yourself that you wanted to make of yourself. And it's the same in China. Like when I studied Chinese, my teachers would set a task and say, what's your Chinese dream? And we'd have to make a speech in Chinese about our Chinese dream. And that's what's happening in China. Everyone they just do whatever they want to do, and it's amazing.
It's very open. It feels like a country that's very open to risks. And that's a big difference, I think. Maybe this is one for another episode, but it's kind of relevant to what we're talking about now. The Gen Z in China is very different to the Gen Z in the West. And a lot of people call Gen Z in the West the generation sensible, right? Because they don't drink and do as much drugs as the previous generations. They're very financially sensible. They invest properly. They don't kind of waste money on consumerism, consumer goods. But in China, it's like almost completely opposite, right? They've seen China being such a successful country. They're much more open to taking risks. So they'll kind of like start investing in startups. They'll start their own projects. They'll spend their money away because they think or they know that the next day they'll just make it back.
And I think they're surrounded by so much inspiration and so much drive.
Exactly,
That rubs starts off.
So many success stories of like
Yeah.
the biggest startups in the world are now Chinese.
Yeah.
We're going off on a tangent. Anyway, so
Never happens.
never happens. So how much, I guess the biggest thing that shocks most people when they start working with China is the difference in kind of like the internet landscapes and
Yeah.
the platforms and technology integration into people's daily lives. What were your thoughts about Chinese digital landscape and Chinese platforms when you first started to kind of get into that?
I was genuinely amazed at just the breadth of functionality in some of these apps. I mean, it's nothing like anything that we have here.
Yeah.
And the way that people really embraced mobile as, you know, part of integration of their everyday lives. In the UK, we talked about the year of mobile for what seemed like at least half a decade. Whereas in China, it clearly became completely ubiquitous at the moment of its introduction.
Yeah.
And as a digital marketer, that's just such an exciting opportunity.
I think it's funny that you mentioned that, actually. I was thinking about this earlier, just before the podcast, and why mobile apps became so powerful in China compared to the West. I think, again, kind of relating, like we always try to relay everything back to user behavior, back to the people behind the platforms, right? So I think one of the biggest, if not the biggest difference that makes this happen is that internet existed in almost a very evolved form before the smartphone came about in the UK, right? Yeah. And that didn't happen in China. So in 2007, only 16% of Chinese population was on the internet. And in 2007, pretty much everyone in the West was on the internet. Like we're talking like 90% penetration, right? So when iPhone launched in 2007, I think it was 2007, 7, 8, 6 or whatever. When they first launched, people had a pre-existing expectation of what the internet experience should be on mobile phones. So they wanted the same thing on their mobile phones, on their smartphones. They wanted the browser, they wanted apps like AIM. Anyone old enough to remember AIM? Not Louisa.
I would admit it, even if I was.
I don't mind. They wanted all the same experience they had on desktop internet ported over to mobile phones. But in China, that didn't exist. Like when WeChat first launched, when the smartphone launched, the internet, that's when the internet really started in China. So they started from a blank sheet. And I think that's why WeChat had the opportunity to create a web of services that the West didn't have. They didn't have that blank sheet, right? They had pre-existing.
Sure.
We talk about this a lot. Like
Very fragmented.
Exactly. They had the legacy of a pre-existing user experience, so they couldn't create a new one. But in China, they didn't have that. So it was like true mobile first. It wasn't like mobile compatible. Internet didn't become like mobile compatible. It was just the mobile and the internet was the same. Was one the same.
Absolutely.
And that wasn't the case in the West, right?
No. I think everyone was trying to mold strategies for mobile. You know, what is our approach to mobile? Whereas obviously in China, it is mobile or it's nothing really. Yeah.
And anyway, that leads on to kind of like leads on to a nice point about what we really want this episode to be about. And we wanted to go through kind of like a day in the life of a Chinese consumer, right? And it was kind of like suggested by Louisa. So starting with the morning, moving on to lunchtime, and finally after work, we wanted to talk about, for the benefit of our audience, like how Chinese, well, I guess first of all, what it's like for a Western user, and then comparing that to what it's like for a Chinese user. And rather than just talking about the platforms, and you can hear about the platforms everywhere on the internet, we want to relate it back to user behavior specifically and why they do these things, and where possible, reference to kind of like the cultural significance that drive these kind of behavior and drive the reason that they use these platforms. So should we start with the morning?
Yes.
Yeah, morning.
Good place to start.
Good place to start, always.
Wake up in the morning.
So when we first wake up in the morning, what kind of apps and what do we do in the UK? Let's start with that, and then we can move on to China.
So I think it'd be quite interesting to compare what you and I use, because I wake up in the morning and the first thing I check is obviously my messages. So I see if anything has come through during the night, because I put my phone on flight mode usually. And then, so I check my WhatsApp, and I check my Instagram because I'm on Instagram a lot.
Wait, you put your phone on flight mode when you sleep?
Yeah, I do.
Whoa, that's crazy.
I know.
So you're
I've only recently started doing that though.
Disconnected.
Yeah,
Whoa,
only recently though because I don't like to be woken up. Cherish my sleep.
It's very wise. Very wise.
Anyway,
I can't get hold of you at like 1 a.m. for work.
Weird. No, so I check my WhatsApp, my WeChat as well, obviously because I work in a Chinese company.
Yeah.
I have to check the WeChat, and Instagram, and then sometimes I have a little browse. Depends on how late I wake up. Just like check the updates on Instagram.
So you've got like WhatsApp and stuff for messages, Instagram for like social. It's kind of mainly around like social interactions, right?
Yeah, but it's mostly about catching up in the morning. So it's not really about. I guess sometimes news, you just want to see what's in the news. So I'd open Feedly, for example, which aggregates all the news on my app. And yeah, how about you?
I try to keep my morning routine pretty concise because, as these guys know, I like to get in early for a cheeky workout before I get into the office. So
Sam works out 3 times a day.
Not every day.
Sometimes more.
Lies, all lies. So yeah, I try and keep things nice and quick. So like you, I will have a quick scan of my WhatsApp messages because I've got some friends who live out in the States. So often I get messages through in the night and I like to, see what I might have to reply to later. And then I'll do a scan usually of the likes of BBC Sport and BBC News. Always check my email, both personal and work, but again, just to see if there's anything urgent that needs to be responded to. And that's pretty much it. I really avoid the likes of Instagram and Facebook because I get totally sucked into the feed.
Yeah, you start scrolling.
I start scrolling. It's a time, it drains all my time. I see something I'm interested in. I then link out to something else. So
rabbit hole.
The rabbit hole, indeed.
So talk about Chinese platforms, and that's the reason why we're here, and that's why our audience is listening to us. So do you guys want to summarize what the morning looks like for a Chinese user? Obviously, I guess kind of like a general view, and then we can talk about the differences after. Yeah,
so I guess it's with the same as with us over here in the West. It depends on what our motivations are to use a specific app. So if you were to check your messages and catch up with messages that have come in overnight, for example, I suppose you'd open WeChat because that's your personal messaging platform. So that's where you're connected to all your friends and families and colleagues or whatever. So you'd just go on there and you check if there's any notifications and maybe reply to your messages. Then it depends whether you'd want to catch up with like news, for example. So you catch up with a platform called Jinri Toutiao, which means today's headlines.
And aptly named.
Yeah. So it's actually a crazy platform. It was explained to me the other day and I downloaded it and tried to use it. And it's just, wow. I mean, the first page is like you scroll through the headlines. So you've got the headlines of the day. It's just a brief headline. You can like click into it and see all the related articles. But there's much, much, much more than that.
Indeed. And I think much how sort of I talked about, going in to check my emails, both, personal and work, all of that content would exist in one place in that WeChat platform. Because as we know in China, people have almost replaced email with WeChat, with conversations on WeChat. So almost what takes me maybe 5 to 6 applications to get the content that I want in the morning, they could theoretically get all from that one place, including news from publishers, brand updates, the stuff that I actually might want to avoid is right there. If they're going in, they might be going in to check their chat with friends.
There's no place to hide.
But there's no place to hide. So that would be dangerous ground for me.
It's a message from my boss next to a message from my girlfriend. Crap.
Right. And, there's a new product being launched that I'm really into.
And they know. And like your work colleagues know that you're on that app. Yeah. So if you don't respond, they're like, wait a minute. Is he like screening me?
And then you've liked something by accident and someone's seen it and you're like, damn it, I was trying to be covert there.
Yeah, exactly. And that links back to what we were saying earlier about how when smartphones or kind of like when mobile internet came about in the West, there's a pre-existing expectation of what people want from the internet, which is independent apps, connected using you guys were talking about Facebook, having a purpose, WhatsApp, Instagram, Apple News, BBC News. They all have their specific purposes, but whereas in China that didn't exist. So WeChat came along and said, why don't we just bundle it all together? it's good for the users, but it's absolutely fantastic for the platform because they have this whole web of services that serves everything that the user needs.
And you don't have to leave the platform.
You don't have to leave the platform. And I think that whole mentality has pushed all platforms on. It's forced innovation really in that space. And like you alluded to it with Toutiao, it's more than just a headline aggregator. It pulls in videos from Douyin. There's like a question and answer functionality within there. It brings you offers from brands when you're in, the appropriate location. So it's sort of like the user has now a higher expectation from platforms, and these platforms have got to keep up with that.
They got to keep up, They got to keep innovating. And with Toutiao, just for the benefit of our audience who are not sure, Toutiao is owned by Bytedance. Bytedance is one of the world's largest. It's the world's largest tech startup. I correct myself. They own Toutiao, and they also own TikTok and Douyin. Douyin is the Chinese version of TikTok, and the thing that really made them popular was the AI algorithm they used for Toutiao to feed news to their users. And I think for the very first time, specifically on Toutiao, and this happened on Douyin as well much later on, that content became driven by AI rather than being driven by your choices or by your network. So people trusted and started to trust the platform to feed them the information that they wanted and the news that they wanted. And like you said, the videos, the offers, it was a very powerful step towards having like what we'd like to call, interest-driven content provided by AI rather than kind of network-driven content provided by a friendships group or your kind of category that you select. And it almost feels so archaic that when we go to our platform, we have to select what we're interested in and we have to build this kind of like profile. You go on Apple News, like before you see anything, you're sitting there like selecting through different screens and you're like, oh, I'm interested in this and like my age is this. It's like, what? You go on Toutiao or you go on Douyin, like you just start feeding videos, start scrolling through them, and it learns by like how long you view them for and whether you like it, like any kind of engagement, any kind of performance metric, that all feeds into kind of your profile. And I think that's really interesting, and it's just kind of like it's another way to show kind of like how evolved Chinese platforms are. And as you were saying, Sam, about how they have to cater for users' expectations. And again, like people in the West don't really have that expectation yet of the platform being smart enough to provide AI.
Yeah.
And for
that, and you don't really expect lots of other functions within an app. So if you go to, I don't know, BBC News, all you want is news.
You just want news.
You don't really want to go on a tab that says like videos or nearby me or I don't know.
They don't have that expectation.
Q&A. You're just there for news.
Yeah, because you go on YouTube if you're on videos here, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Whereas
you've got all
you
your
have
separate
these
apps.
crazy ecosystems that serves everything in China.
So I do think to a point that specific apps in China, even though there is so much in it in one app, like Xiaohongshu, for example, there's also so much in there. But your main purpose to go to Xiaohongshu is to get reviews. So even though you can do a lot more on the app, your main purpose is to get reviews.
Yeah.
But then again, you can also access it through WeChat.
Through WeChat, yeah, exactly. You can access everything through WeChat.
Yeah, it makes everything very shareable as well, because if the app's linked to WeChat, then you can share it.
Good.
Yeah.
Cool. So should we move on to the next phase of the day, which is the commute to work? And everyone does this.
Yes.
Do you guys want to get started and talk about the UK?
Sure, yeah.
Sure.
Shall I start? So, yeah, my commute is it's not particularly exciting, but I walk down to the bus station. I use my contactless card to get the bus. And then I do the same to get on the train.
Very modern.
Very modern.
Card though, not Apple Pay.
Still a card, not Apple Pay. I'm not that
You don't
modern.
use Apple Pay?
I don't use Apple Pay. I don't.
You don't trust it?
I just used to use my card. That's what I do. I use my card.
Legacy behavior.
Exactly. The baggage.
Yeah.
The baggage. And then I usually try and settle in to review in a bit more depth the headlines that I would have picked out in the morning during my scan of the various sort of news publishers that I look at.
So you go back to the apps like BBC News and Apple News.
Exactly. And I sort of delve a little bit deeper in whatever caught my eye. And then I will have a little look through my feeds because I have a bit more time on my hands. And then at some point, I will either have exhausted that or I would have lost internet connection and I have to go very old school and go to paper.
What?
Bust out a book or a newspaper.
The
or
metro,
something.
yeah.
Exactly. I usually have a little scan through the metro. And then when I get off the other side, I will go and grab my coffee and my breakfast.
How do you pay for that?
Contactless card again. Yeah, not quite fully frictionless.
Apple Pay,
Yeah.
Not quite Apple Pay, and not even that's not fully frictionless compared to WeChat Pay and so forth. And yeah, that's pretty much my commute.
Cool. Great.
I don't think mine's very different. The only thing that I might add is Spotify. So I listen to music on Spotify.
So you got a music app as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I use Spotify. Other people might use Apple Music or whatever. But yeah, that's I think the only addition to the commute. And then because we don't really have Wi-Fi on the tube. So we have Wi-Fi on tube stations.
God, don't get me started on
but
internet
not
on
the tube.
Oh my God.
Whereas in China, everyone has Wi-Fi on the tube.
Not just Wi-Fi, they have cellular signal on the tube. Everyone literally is permanently connected to the internet. That's a big difference. There's like
Absolutely,
no downtime
yeah.
in China
Right.
when you're commuting. What about in China? What are you guys thoughts on kind of like the Chinese journey when people are commuting?
So
to
there's
work?
various pillars here. So it's in terms of like payment. So for example, if you were to get your coffee in the morning, or I don't know how many Chinese people now drink coffee
Drink coffee.
in the
Slice
morning.
of coffee, please.
I think more and more people now drink coffee in the morning in China because it's becoming a thing.
Yeah,
with
it's true
Starbucks
actually.
and
Yeah.
things.
Become trendy, is it?
But yeah, jianbing. So it's street food in the morning in China is just heaven. So basically, what happens is rather than going to your Pret and your Costa and whatever and getting your breakfast on your way to work, there's street food everywhere. So you'd have the IE who's pushing the little wagon with a gas station and the
those are the
fire, and
best.
they just make the thing in front of you.
Oh my
It
God.
costs maybe 30p.
Yeah.
And then you'd either pay in cash, really old school, or you just WeChat them the money.
No one pays in cash
And then
anymore.
when you WeChat them the money,
Sometimes, because it's like three kwai or something.
you use a QR code, right? You would
Yeah.
just scan the
You
vendor's
scan it.
QR code, transaction done,
And I
frictionless,
love this
smooth.
because, like, I swear technology has created a level of trust that didn't exist before. Like, they don't even check whether you've actually paid. You scan it, you put the money in, and it goes bin, and then they're just like, people just assume that you've paid because it's so little amount of money anyway, right? Like, it doesn't really matter too much. And I've told that story before about kind of me getting a cab and I didn't have the cash, I couldn't pay, and the guy would just like pay me later on Alipay. And they trusted me to do that because the technology, it was so easy. There was no reason for you not to do that. And there was no reason for you to cheat.
That's a huge cultural difference, though. Here, could you imagine that?
Yeah,
here?
I know.
Oh, no way.
Never happened.
It wouldn't happen. It
It's
just
like,
wouldn't
show me the
happen.
confirmation. Like, send me the...
Yeah. Don't go. Pay me now.
yeah.
Leave
Have
me
you
your
really
liver.
paid me? Yeah. So I think that's a big difference in terms of payments. I mean, when I pay for my coffee at Pret, for example, I do pay with my Apple Pay.
Yeah, me too.
So I'm advanced like that, but so I'm cardless. But well, can you say cardless because your card is still connected to your phone?
Yeah, it's not really true kind of mobile wallet.
Not really.
You're just paying via your phone. It's like the conduit between the card.
Yeah.
But the user experience is much slicker.
It's better, yeah, definitely. Whereas in China, like you can just WeChat, as we said, you can scan the codes, or you can use Alipay. And for the benefit of our listeners, so Alipay and WeChat are like competitors because they're owned by two different. So it's Alibaba versus Tencent. Exactly. And then, for example, if you buy something on Taobao, you can't pay via WeChat Pay
Because it's owned by Alibaba.
because it's owned by Alibaba, and vice versa. Like when you do something on WeChat, you can't pay
If
on
you buy
Alipay.
something on JD.
JD. I don't think you can use Alipay on JD.
Yeah, I think they embed with Tencent and WeChat.
And that dynamic's quite interesting, the sort of competitive nature of the market.
That's a good point. Yeah, you don't really
between
have
us.
that in the West.
Not so
Yeah.
much. There's a little bit more of integration, not fully, but there is a little bit more cooperation.
Everyone is
so to
kind of
speak.
like, I guess the users hold all the platforms accountable for being kind of what's the word I'm looking for being more open and more integrated and just kind of like being more friendly with each other in terms of doing business. Whereas in China, it almost feels like it's a wild west. Like you can't even visit. Like WeChat would literally block websites for you to visit from their browser because they're owned by the competitor. And no one really complains, no one cares. It's just the way it is.
accepted.
And again, I think that's related to the fact that internet basically didn't exist before the mobile phone infrastructure, before smartphones. They can pretty much do what they want because they started a new way of kind of like communicating, right? So this is a way it's always been. Therefore, why should we change?
Yeah. But yeah, if we move on to different pillars on the commute, so like
Getting transport.
Yeah, like do you guys, I
yeah.
guess you guys don't cycle, so you don't use like Santander cycles or...
I have done before.
Yeah?
But
what was that like?
to work.
To work? No, not to
good
work.
night out.
I have used one before. Yeah, I have used one after a night out. That's another story in itself.
What was that like? What was the experience like? How did you...
It was difficult. I was quite drunk. But yeah, I mean, the experience, it was fine. It was kind of like, it was nice to have that facility of the bike option, but a little bit clunky in terms of payment method and, how, where I had to drop the bike off, and it wasn't so slick, so to speak. Whereas in China, they have a really fantastic infrastructure, for that method of transportation in Mobike. And again, payment, everything through WeChat. So it's a really, really simple, sort of payment structure.
Yeah.
And
so there's no
experience.
docks, which is really interesting.
No docks,
Whereas
yeah.
Santander, you'd
world
have to
is your
find a
dock.
docking station. And then in China, you'd find like a Mobike or whatever kind of company that provides a bike. You find it wherever, you scan the code, you unlock it, you ride it, and then once you've locked the bike, it takes the money out of your account depending on how far you went. And
you can drop it off wherever.
Just wherever you want. Yeah, it's amazing.
But I don't think... Because you can get Mobikes in this country, right? We see them around sometimes. And
I don't know how to use them over here though. Like, can I scan it with my WeChat?
Yeah,
I tried the other day
I think
and
it's
it
the
didn't
app, isn't it?
work. Do you
No?
need the app?
I think you need the app here. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's slightly different.
An extra app.
But I don't think it can really...
More apps.
More apps. I don't think it kind of like work really here because... So in China, there's always, you see a lot of people going around that work for Mobike that tidy everything up.
Oh
So
yes,
they
yeah.
drop
You have a big
people-
van
yeah,
and they
exactly.
put the bikes
they
in
take
the
the
van
bikes
and
on, they put them in
redistribute.
designated spots.
Yeah.
They make sure people are not chucking them everywhere. It's like all over the streets. Like we saw a statue made of Mobikes in Camden the other day by some drunk people. It was so weird. It was
my
like
God.
something out of Game of Thrones.
Or like a modernist sculpture.
Yeah, or an art installation. Depends how you look at it. But in China, someone would have tidied that up and would have put them in specific locations. I think here, like manpower is such a valuable commodity that something like that, I just don't think it would work in this country as well as it has worked in China. But I guess only time will tell. So I guess some of the biggest difference are that we don't have a downtime. There's no downtime in China. Yes. We're always connected, whether you're on the tube. People tend to, again, stick probably with the similar platforms they do in the morning to go back and view the same things, whether it's kind of like, again, we keep going back to the idea of kind of like a social OS where you can do everything within one app. And also on the transport point of view, I think there's probably a lot more flexibility, especially with Mobike and being able to kind of, like you guys don't ride bikes to work probably because there's a lot of trouble, right? There's not a Santander cycle outside your house, but chances are there probably is a Mobike outside someone's house in China.
I think also with that always on connectivity, there are more opportunities for brands to sort of, make themselves known within people's day.
Exactly. That's a very good
especially
point.
within that part of the day. And I think the commute is a really potentially impactful time to reach someone because it is that sort of downtime for them, and we don't actually have that much of it in today's world. So it's a really poignant time to connect with people. So the likes of Toutiao, this news aggregator, but also an opportunity for brands to deliver offers to people, and also an opportunity for brands to deliver a message through PR by being present within publisher articles and so forth. With WeChat being such an all-encompassing platform that it is, there's always an opportunity there for a brand, whereas they wouldn't been able to catch me in my commute because I try and avoid some of those applications.
It's a very good point, yeah.
especially applications that have ads, but you can always do things a bit more covertly. So on like Toutiao, like you said, you can do it via PR, or on WeChat you can write really lovely articles and you can get your influencers to share it, or I don't know, other platforms, like for example on WeChat lots of people follow things to do in Shanghai or whatever, these kind of things. So you could go via them and say, like, this is an experience.
And we forgot QQ Music.
Oh, yes.
Which is the sort of Spotify equivalent. Which
is owned by Tencent.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
QQ Music, Xiaomi Music, and NetEase Music. So there's obviously lots of different music streaming.
And there are similar branding opportunities as well. It's something I've noticed on those platforms. For example, today we noticed an ad for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the new Tarantino movie that's releasing. You know, they're advertising on that platform. There's a branded playlist from, you know, by Tarantino, you know, his favorite songs, playlists, you know, from the movie and his previous back catalogue of films. So, you know, there are opportunities there for brands that exist similar to how they do here.
And that's kind of like so that's really interesting, because it's not just like an overt advert, like a kind of like a banner or like a drop in of like a 20-second like radio type advert. It's actually a piece of content that the user want at that moment in time. Like they're listening to music anyway, right?
Exactly.
Might as well try this piece of music out.
Fantastic.
And have the opportunity to kind of drop the brand and drop some awareness. And that's a very good point, because we talk about WeChat and how brands should use WeChat, and I think the point you made here is very good, and it connects to the fact that if you really want to succeed on WeChat or any Chinese platform for that matter, it should be more about service and utility than it is about kind of like awareness here in the UK and in the West, right?
Absolutely.
So rather than kind of like doing overt piece of advertising, you know, like evocative video that's just about the brand, you should probably just create a service, like something that people would actually use on their commute, or create content that people would actually want to read. I know it sounds obvious, right? But I think in China, this is more impactful because of the always connectedness, the fact that they're using kind of like web services in platforms. It's more extreme in China than it is here.
And they're open to all sorts of different types of content from different creators. So it doesn't matter who creates it. They're very experimental. So it's like you find a new article and it looks really cool, and then it's shareable, and There's
so much growth as well in that sort of online to offline experience in retail in particular, which is an area that, you know, brands can sort of help to deliver the additional value add piece. And like, you know, to your point, it's very much driven in the same way that the user's expectation of platforms is heightened, and it forces them to innovate. You know, it's the same for their expectation of brands.
And I think actually from like we're only through the not even half the day yet, and the biggest difference I think between Western platforms, Western social networks, and Chinese social platform is that Western social platforms are still just social platforms. They're still social networking platforms. In China, people literally use social network platforms to get shit done. And I think that's the biggest difference that people don't quite comprehend. Like they're literally not social media platforms anymore. They are an operating system by nature.
You'd use it to book an appointment at your doctor, with your dentist, you know.
Pay your utility bills on WeChat. It's amazing.
Just fucking get shit done on it. You're not just on there to talk to your friends, to like look at moments. You do everything on these social network.
And every other platform has social features as well. So for every platform you'd have a login with your own profile, and then you'd collect things that you like and you'd recommend things, and people would find you on the platform and see what you kind of recommend, these kind of things. Whereas I don't think we have a login on like BBC News. Like you might have a login, but you don't really have a profile. Like
exactly.
The profile is only for the provider. That
it's not getting smarter.
Platform.
It's still like a newspaper where they dictate what you're reading.
They tell you what you're
kind
reading.
of anonymous as well. So there's a bit less accountability
That's
with
also
what you do
true.
on the platform. And
Chinese people are not as not as precious about their data, because especially if it helps to improve their lives and it helps to improve the service design that surrounds them.
They have that sort of a greater sense of digital self that they, sort of project on these platforms and they own on these platforms, which they value.
And you'd be omnipresent on every platform, so that if you have your favorite celebrity, you can find them on Xiaohongshu, you can find them on Weibo, you can find them literally on every single platform.
Should we move on to work?
Yes,
I think work is really interesting, actually. So at work, what do you guys do on your phones? Working, obviously.
Obviously.
Well, the ideal answer would be we don't use our phones at work.
But we're a social media agency, so...
Yeah, and we work with China, so WeChat.
So we need
obviously.
WeChat.
Okay, maybe like put yourself in the footstep of like a regular British person who doesn't work with China.
I think it's more about so work takes place on the desktop, I would say, on the PC. So you'd have your laptop or your PC or whatever, and that's where your work is, and that's where you do your emails and your communications with colleagues. It's all via emails, all like browsing on browsers, and only if you've got anything urgent. So if your mum calls you, or I don't know, then you would maybe use your phone. Or sometimes sneakily, when you just can't concentrate anymore, you'd like check your WhatsApp messages. Cheeky Instagram.
Flick.
Yeah. Yeah, but you wouldn't really like use your phone much, would you?
Not very much. I think obviously depending on what space you work in, what industry you work in, I suppose we always had a need to be genuinely checking social media, from more of like a research perspective than anything else. Twitter as well, fantastic for gaining industry news,
definitely.
and that might be stuff.
Yeah, but you can use that on your desktop, can't you?
You can use that on your desktop.
Your phone.
Yeah, indeed, you can. Yeah, I would actually use it largely on my desktop.
Yeah.
And you would send stuff over to around your colleagues and maybe to clients. So I suppose you're still engaging with social, but not on your phone.
It's still the pre-existing defined use of the internet, as we were saying earlier.
Yeah.
What about in China? What do you think life is like at work in China in relation to platforms and mobile and digital?
Well, it all comes back to WeChat, I think. So this was the point that we were making earlier, that if we think about whether we can survive a day without a phone over here, I think I could. I think I'd be fine because I'd have everything else that I need at work.
Yeah, it's true. Because you're on your emails and your desktop all the time anyway.
I wouldn't like it, but
I wouldn't like it,
Yeah.
but
it's
it'll happen.
doable.
And my
You
friends
might
would
find
think I'm
yourself
dead.
reaching for your phone. I
Yeah.
generally do that. I'll just be like, oh no, wait, I don't have my phone.
But you can still go about your work life. Like you can still talk to your clients and you can still get your work done. Like you don't necessarily need your phone if you don't work in a Chinese company.
Yeah.
Whereas in a Chinese company, you definitely need WeChat. And even if you use it on the desktop, you can use WeChat on your desktop. You'd still need your phone to log in. No phone, no business.
I quickly learned, working here, that WeChat is absolutely integral, especially when working with Chinese clients. They'll ask you, actually, can we keep our comms to WeChat rather than email? We're just not so comfortable or, used to using email for our communications. And I think that's partly because it actually makes communications a little bit faster, because it forces you to be, more concise and to speak in, much more of a shorthand way rather than, taking time to sometimes compose an email. So maybe sometimes we spend too much time doing
definitely.
when we don't really need to. Sometimes it's
You
necessary.
craft the email, right?
Yeah,
You craft an email.
And you're like, does it sound okay?
In situations that's appropriate. But I think for a lot of day-to-day stuff, you could it's actually a lot quicker to communicate via sort of private.
And this is like a debate. I think we had this debate before at work about whether you should send voice messages or whether you should type things out, because voice messages are easier for the sender, but written messages are easier for the reader.
Yeah.
So what's like, does that kind of mean when you're talking to a client, maybe you should be like writing? I think most people do. And when the client is talking to the agency, they'll tend to send voice messages, right?
It's the client's prerogative, right?
It is, right?
But we always have to maintain a level of professionalism and service, of course.
Yeah. And then you need a Chinese recipient to listen to the message and decode.
And what do you guys think? So I have a thought on this. I think, do you think WeChat using WeChat for work, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because obviously it blurs the line between life and work.
That's the tricky one, because over here you'd have two phones. If you work in like a big company, you'd have a work phone and you'd have your personal phone, so that you could separate both things, and it would be separated by the number.
Or you have emails, as Sam mentioned earlier. It's got his work email and his personal email.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas in China, if you have WeChat and you do work on WeChat, it's very blurry. Like, you've got work messages, you've got personal messages. When can you switch off?
Exactly. And do you think so? I think that's okay in China. There's a few reasons what I mentioned later, but do you think that kind of lifestyle will work here, in the sense that your life and work becomes kind of very blurred? I know like places like Google and Facebook, they try to foster this culture where they provide you with kind of like food and, you know, nap pods. You can basically live at work. Do you think that could happen here? Like, could there be a platform where people do everything from work to kind of life and personal communications?
I think there is a trend towards that, particularly in creative industry.
Yeah, tech and creative, definitely.
Tech and creative, using more instantaneous communication methods, Slack and sort of similar platforms like that to communicate.
So I want to relate the work-life balance and how WeChat has blurred the line between work and life back into Chinese culture. And I think it's a very specific reason why that can happen in China as opposed to the West. Because I think work and life historically in China has always been quite connected anyway. I don't know, you guys obviously know kind of like the favour culture in China, right? So when you want something done, you go to your friends, and that's the Guanxi culture we talked about before on the show. The favour culture is that when someone does something for you, you tend to kind of like owe them a favour, whether it's professional or personal. And there's also this blurred line between kind of like money for commercial and money as a gift for personal reasons. Like in the West, you don't really give money to people as a gift. That's not a thing. That's kind of rude, actually, right?
Yeah.
Unless it's
money,
my granddad. He's allowed to give me money.
Unless it's your grandparents.
I will accept all forms of money, FYI.
You can send them to Qumin, number 10 Greenland Street. And in the West, you kind of want to give them like a gift that you personally thought about. And that's kind of the culture here, right? You give someone a gift. But in China, like, giving money is genuinely a form of gratitude, a form of communication, like a social communication between people.
Yeah.
Like you do in Chinese New Year, red packets. Not only do you give it to your family, like the parents give it to their kids, the grandparents give it to their kids, but you also give it to your colleagues. Like the boss will give to their staff. Sometimes you might even give it to your colleagues. It's a genuinely accepted form of communication and way of fostering social relationships. And I think that has led to the fact that, because business is all about money, right? It's about making money, and money as a form of kind of like social, almost like a social currency. It's not just a currency; it's a social currency, and that's connected life and work more closer than anything else. It existed anyway, and I talked to this before about WeChat, that WeChat is almost like a digital reflection of Chinese culture, and this is another reason, and with the digital red packet on WeChat as well. So for the benefit of audience who don't know this, you can send red packets to people on WeChat. And this is another reason how they've kind of like integrated Chinese cultural, kind of like Chinese culture into kind of the platform, right? So it's made the line between work and life even closer. And that's why I think it works much better in China than it does in the West. And I personally don't think it'll ever work that closely in the West, because people want that kind of separation, want that privacy. And there's nothing else to really connect work and life culture together. And finally, we're on to lunchtime.
I think that's our favourite time of day, isn't it?
Lunchtime is our favourite
Best
time.
time
It's a
ever.
favourite
Love
time actually for many Chinese people as well.
Because they love food.
Exactly. Do you guys want to start by talking about in the UK lunchtime, and then we can move on to kind of the platforms and
Sure. So I think it depends whether you brought your packed lunch in.
yeah.
or whether you go out for lunch. Sometimes
Those are
you
the
just
two options, really, aren't they?
yeah.
Those are the only two.
Sometimes you're on the tube and you're like, oh no, I forgot my packed lunch in the fridge. And then you've got to go out and actually physically buy something. But then you just probably go to a shop and pay with your card, cash, mobile wallet, whatever, and then get your food.
I think
You wouldn't
And
really
the
order
options
it.
are basically within walking distance.
Yeah.
How shit is that?
right.
And you wouldn't really order a takeaway for lunch. I think that's a bit bougie.
Unless you were
do that.
doing, unless you were doing like a team,
Yeah.
like a team
And it's a
meeting,
special
like a
occasion.
brainstorm session, or you know, it was like a special occasion for someone in the agency. At birthday, you might be like, okay, we're going to order in for the agency, and you'd use Deliveroo or Just Eat, Uber Eats. Those
It's
sort
an
of our main
occasion, an
platforms.
exception to the rule.
Yeah, exactly.
But you wouldn't really normally do that at lunchtime as on your own. Wouldn't be like, I'm
course
going to
not.
get
But
myself
there
a
is
curry.
an app for that.
Yeah.
What's that?
There is an app for that.
An app, yeah.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What about China?
In China.
The land of
So-
food.
Yeah, so we've spoken about this previously at work, haven't we? How
Yeah.
there's designated areas for delivery drivers at work.
I'm so
How
hungry.
amazing is that?
Because there's so many. Because you can really, really easily just order something for lunch in China because it's so cheap and it's so quick. So you can use platforms like Ulama or Meituan. Meituan is really, really popular. And you just find a meal for, I don't know, £3 to £4. So cheap. Maybe even less. And then delivery fee is maybe 30p max, something like that.
But-
10 to 30p.
And it's super reliable, right?
Yeah.
So there's like a guarantee for the user that, you know, if the food is late, the delivery driver has to pay rather than you have to pay.
Yeah.
So it sort of ensures that you get your food on time, and like we read up on, you know, you often see these delivery drivers running through the streets to
Yeah,
make
it's
sure they
kind of
get
like-
the food there
I
on
think
time.
sometimes
they
it's a bit sad.
don't
There's
have
kind
to
of
pay
like a
for it
moral
themselves.
discussion around that, right? But
But it's that infrastructure, like similar to mobile.
the focus on service,
It makes that that sort of
it's
delivery
the,
possible. It makes it possible.
It's the commodity of kind of manpower is a lot more readily available in China
Because there's so many more
because of the
people that are
size
going to do the
of the country, and that's the biggest difference, right? So the biggest difference it's that in the West, ordering out at lunchtime and having almost unlimited choice is an exception to the rule rather than the rule itself. But in China, it's a complete opposite. Like you almost like less people bring food from home than they do from ordering out, and
'Cause it's
ordering
cheaper.
out. Yeah, exactly. It's cheaper, it's nicer, it's easier, it saves time.
And it saves time. I think we seem this is a trend. We always seem
Yeah.
to see a lot of these things. They all save time. It makes
Exactly.
everything more efficient.
Yeah.
Ordering out is literally the rule rather than the exception to the rule. And that's completely opposite. Ordering out, having unlimited choice is your daily life in China for lunch.
Yeah.
So how does that experience manifest on mobile then?
Well, these apps are mobile. They're mobile apps. They're not. You don't order stuff on your desktop. You
So you can have a separate app for it. So like Meituan, you'd have a separate app, and then you'd order through the app, I think, usually, and then you could pay via WeChat or Alipay. Integrated
Exactly.
like super seamlessly. You wouldn't
Yeah.
have to
You don't
key
have
your
to
card
bust your
details
card
in.
out. You don't have them on the
Yeah.
account.
And if
Yeah.
you order for a friend, they can
Exactly.
easily just
Transfer
transfer
you
you
the
the
Wire
money.
you the
via-
money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
WeChat.
super
Yeah.
easy.
Imagine sending your friend, like you go out for dinner with your friends and then someone just says, okay, I'm going to pay for the meal. And then afterwards, everyone's just going to WhatsApp you the money. It's super easy.
Fantastic.
And the other thing, I guess, is kind of like the food culture in China. And we talk about food a lot. Absolutely love food, obviously. I think a lot of the guys that work here love food. And in China, food is not just... I don't know. I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like in the West, like, I swear, sometimes people eat just to stay alive. And in China, it's...
Not if you're from Italy.
Like in China, I'm alive because of food, you know? That's like completely different. Like everywhere, it doesn't matter if you're the CEO of the business or if you're like an accounting exec, like everyone stops at lunch for some decent food because you have that choice with the apps. When you didn't have that, you go downstairs and there's like food places everywhere.
Yeah.
It's not just like, oh, today in the UK, I'm going to have a sandwich or a pasta.
Yeah.
No, you have like choice from all over China. You have Western food everywhere. Like food is part
Yeah.
of everyone's life.
And it's so deeply ingrained that there's also like, instead of saying, hey, how are you? You'd say, 你吃了吗?
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point.
Have you
yeah.
eaten?
That's like a
Chifanlama.
genuine greeting. Instead of how are you, it's like chifanlama, and
Yeah.
you just start conversations with food.
It's a very Jewish thing as well, I can tell
Really?
you.
And actually, I see a lot of similarity between the
Interesting.
Jewish culture and the
Yeah.
Chinese culture. It's like very family focused and very food focused.
Like to feed people.
Like to feed people, yeah. I need to come around to yours.
Welcome
Yeah, so
anytime.
kind of the biggest difference in the food culture and how apps enable the food culture. And we're seeing a theme here. We were talking earlier about how the life and work, how it was already very close, and then apps enabling that culture in China. And now we're seeing the food culture being enabled by smartphones, mobile apps on smartphones in China. And finally, after work is interesting. Do you guys want to talk about what it's like in the UK after work?
It's quite a personal thing, of course.
Excuse me?
It's hard to define one singular routine for someone
Yeah.
after work, right? There are so many different, hobbies, interests, user behaviours and so forth. But I suppose TV is one thing that is that is pretty big here. I mean, obviously we've seen a huge shift over time from consuming the way people consume TV. It's now much more sort of on demand and on a digital level, and people consuming a lot more sort of content through the likes of YouTube.
Yep.
So TV time is decreasing, but it still tends to be a TV set tends to be the hub of the home.
Yeah.
So whether it's connected to Netflix or Amazon Prime, it's still through the TV, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which is a bit different, I think, to China.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how it works in terms of linking your apps to your TV set in China. It's probably really seamless. But people don't really watch TV anymore, I've been told. It might be the older generation that still watches the things that are on like CCTV or whatever in China. But whereas I come home and I might just plonk in front of the TV and just flick through the channels, see what's on, maybe watch a bit of David Attenborough. They wouldn't really do that in China, so you'd go home and then you'd open your Chinese, so you can never really say equivalent, but what's the Chinese equivalent to Netflix, which would be like iQIYI or Tencent Video or Youku, and then depending on it's the same as over here. Some series might be on iQIYI, some series might be on Youku, Tencent Video. It's like some series over here might be on Netflix, some might be on like Now TV.
Now TV,
whatever.
or Sky, or whatever you're watching on. But I think it's that development of, I suppose, their equivalent of YouTube, where they will now go for that premium programming, whereas YouTube is still is obviously huge here, and people consume a lot of content on there, but it's typically from maybe influencers that they follow, maybe less than high production value broadcast style TV, which is where people would consume it in China.
It's a very good point. I think the biggest difference is what you guys spoke about first is TV, right? It's the fact that I'm going to embarrass you guys here. It's the fact that you guys still watch Love Island on the TV.
Hey, it's great.
These guys will literally come into the office and talk about Love Island. I'm just like, oh my
Not even
God,
that
what
good.
is going in the 90s? Not that often. Sometimes you guys talk about Love Island. I know.
You
I
secretly watched it as well, just admit it.
I watch it on YouTube. I watch the clips. No, I don't. So in China, this doesn't happen, right? Like people, I think you're right as well. You hit the nail on the head when you said that the older generation will still watch TV. And I know this because when I go home, when I'm hanging out with my aunts and my cousins, I'll see that my aunts and uncles will be watching the TV, like some old school program or a costume drama, some news. He'll be flicking through channels. And my cousin will be on his mobile phone watching short form lo-fi video. Not even video on demand. And you guys talked about this earlier. Video on demand is different to kind of short form lo-fi video.
Absolutely.
So you have like Netflix, and then you have iQIYI, which is kind of a lot of it is still video on demand, like series is made by the digital platforms themselves. And then you have stuff like Bilibili, you have stuff like Douyin,
These are all
Youku,
short-form
which
video
is much
apps.
more focused on short form lo-fi video. And I think we've kind of like decreasing attention span more so in China than anywhere else.
Yeah,
that
in
people
China
are
it's
more-
crazy. The number of hours spent a day watching short form videos. So I think 600 million hours a day are spent watching short form videos.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think that's just on Douyin.
It might be, or overall, I'm not quite sure. It was one of the reports I read recently. It might be aggregated throughout the platforms, but it's still a huge number.
Huge amount.
But Douyin has about 250 million daily active users. And Douyin is Chinese TikTok. Yeah.
And I think the huge growth in cell phone data consumption, which I think was up 189% year on year, which is insane.
And that's gonna just increase exponentially with 5G.
Absolutely. And that was almost like entirely down to the explosion in consumption of short form videos.
Exactly, yeah. And I think, I mean, in terms of kind of like the West, I think we already start to see that happening in the West, right? So people are starting to watch, and it relates back to when we first started talking about Toutiao and how people are starting to trust AI to serve them content rather than selecting content themselves, or rather than being given a program by like the news or the TV stations or some form of a media. That short form, especially Douyin, short form video, like you're just scrolling through videos. Like you're not selecting what you're watching, you're showing what you're watching. And like in relation to like a brand, is that better for brands to be able to produce content that are related to what the users want, and they're more willing and they're given kind of like more screen time to branded content, do you guys think?
Yeah, I think so, especially if you go back to the TV versus not TV. Like over here, you'd watch Love Island and you'd be served ad breaks. And there'd be brand advertisement every, 10 minutes or something. And then you'd have to sit there and watch that until you can continue watching Love Island. Whereas if you've got short form videos, there's not really like ads like that. Well, if you produce good content.
It's a much more social experience.
Yeah.
So everything is tagged with hashtags, and that in itself gives brands an opportunity to lend their brand to a particular trend or to create a particular trend themselves.
But more so, it's
much more active than passive.
Yeah, it's much more integrated into your experience, right? Like I use Douyin a lot. I love the platform. You can get all kinds of content on there. Sometimes I'm scrolling through these videos. I don't even realize I'm watching a fucking ad. Like, because it's within my interest.
Yeah.
Like I'll be watching videos about like games or something, for example, and then I'll be shown an ad about a game and I'll be like, oh, this is quite interesting. And then I realize it's got like a tiny little ad tag on it. It's like, oh shit, I'm watching an ad. And I think that's also a big difference as platforms evolve. And again, we always talk about how this, like China is almost like a preview of the future for the West. With YouTube, they're trying to do that by serving you ads that are relevant. It's still not very good. It still feels like advertising.
And people, really are quite vocal about disliking the way ads are served on YouTube. And obviously, there have been some serious issues with around that over like the past 12 months in terms of brand safety and how that works. So I think it is like a little window into the future in terms of what we see in China.
You literally stop noticing that you're watching ads, and that's a good thing for both the brand and the user because it's better experience for the user and it's better exposure for the brand.
We're very, very ad adverse. That's why we pay for subscriptions. Like for my Spotify, I pay monthly subscriptions because I don't want any ads on Spotify.
Direct debits have come out on my account for platforms. It's getting ridiculous.
It's crazy.
I think that what we just talked about is why influencers are so important in China. That whole sort of influencer culture, is so powerful and impacts so many people.
Because people don't see it as an ad. People see it as genuine advice or entertainment.
Exactly.
Okay, I think we've gone through a lot.
We have gone through a lot.
and
not even scratched the surface.
Everything.
We started. I think we can probably make an episode on each of the platforms and each period in the day in their own right. But I hope that gives our audience kind of like a preview of what it's like in China and also how it relates back to some of the culture that influences these behaviors and how these platforms have become so popular. And thank you very much, Sam and Louisa, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.